happily ensconced in their own offices in two European capitals, while I'm on my couch here in Chicago. So this is, of course, the question of the glass being half empty or half full because of our naturally socially distanced mode of existence. For the purpose of this discussion, which has the suggestive title Science+Fiction, and of course, it's the mixture, the overlap, also maybe the dividing lines that we're going to talk about. I wanted to start with maybe with a kind of long view. We are here to talk about how different kinds of thinkers, but also different kinds of entertainments, from novel reading to obsessive movie watching, comfort us, give us matter to ponder, but also in some ways could have helped us in a more concrete way to conceive and prepare for this and other disasters that have enveloped most of the world. So taking the long view, is this a moment to think about pandemics stretching back to, I don't know, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Exodus? Are we to think of our own position in relation to storytelling from the beginning, and the kinds of witnesses humans have left for each other, which are often witnesses of moments of hardship and misery? And I wonder whether our own maybe extended now, not just plague year of 2020, but let's say epoch or interregnum, will produce anything to rival these epics, or even anything to rival Frankenstein, Nosferatu, and Soderbergh's film Contagion. So just a bit of a start in time. Where do you start thinking about pandemics?
Well, I'll begin by maybe just throwing out a few things. Because I mean, pragmatically, people keep asking me, yeah, well, how is it going to help me in my everyday life to read Camus or to read Mary Shelley? And I say, well, it's not going to help you do your shopping, and it's perhaps not going to help you deal with illness around you. Although already there, I'm going to be cautious. But I was thinking about this because it's almost a year now that we have been locked down in Switzerland, just a little under a year. And the reason I got so interested in this what I'm calling the pandemic archive isn't because I used to already do work on this. I mean, I did know individual texts and individual films, but not in this context. But it was more, here we were suddenly at home, we suddenly couldn't move, and we were deeply, deeply confused. We were really disoriented in a radically existential way. And we started telling, when I say we, my friends and I, on the phone, in Zoom, whatever, started telling ourselves stories and asking ourselves, how can we orient ourselves in this situation, which for us in Switzerland at least is completely novel. I in my life have never experienced anything. I've experienced no wars at home. That's one of my lucky aspects of where I have been living. I have experienced no major catastrophes that made things stand still completely. And that's when I felt it's not just that we need stories to tell to each other in order to make sense of what is happening around us, or to try out things even, what does your story sound like as opposed to my story. But that's where I really did feel, going back and looking at how have other people described pandemics can be actually comforting. I mean, you could also say this is depressing, because I was surprised when I looked for it that what the Boccaccio describes in the Decameron for the 15th century, or what Defoe describes for the 18th century England, there are so many similarities to what we were either doing or ended up doing. So it's kind of like something keeps repeating itself. And as I say, you could say, isn't this terrible? Doesn't this mean that people don't learn anything from the past? But I also thought, no, it does mean we can look at this and we can see how certain things repeat. And this takes away the sense this is a catastrophe, this is the apocalypse, because these were the emails people were writing me. How can you live in these terrible apocalyptic times? And I can say, but we're very far away from the apocalypse where we are right now. Reread The Apocalypse, which is one of the other things that I did. So as a way of orienting, putting perspective, but also trying to make sense of what is happening around you, that was really what got me interested in the in looking at this archive again. Texts which up to that point I had read very differently, like Nosferatu. Who reads Nosferatu as a film about a pandemic? It's a vampire story, or it's a story about the First World War. But actually, no, it is also very much what happened to COVID as it moved from Wuhan to, in my case, Zurich.
Yes, I mean, taking my cue from Elisabeth, when one thinks about a history of science perspective on making sense of this pandemic, the first response that I had, especially as a historian of science in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, is one of eerie familiarity. We tend to think about science as the sharp point of the moving arrow of modernity. And to a large extent, that is absolutely just as a description. But when confronted with an absolute novelty, like this virus, SARS-CoV-2, for at least the first few weeks, scientists and especially clinicians were in a position that resembled nothing so much as the 17th century. And the attempts, the wild attempts in many ways, of the natural philosophers of that day, the early members of the first scientific societies like the Royal Society of London, or the Academia Naturae Curiosorum, or the Académie Royale des Sciences, to try and understand phenomena like the plague. The last major European outbreak of the plague was in 1720, but also any number of other phenomena like luminescence, a cold light that shines in the dark, from ground zero. So the kinds of Twitter feed that you would see amongst doctors in New Jersey, in Wuhan, in London, in Zurich, in Berlin, trying to treat the cases were, to me, eerily familiar as the curious cases of the 17th century, in which one is looking at a single observation and trying to decide whether or not this is simply what doctors call a fascinoma, or whether it can bear the weight of generalizations. Now, almost a year into this, we can see that some numbers have converged, some statistics have stabilized, some occasional observations have proved not to be weight bearing. But in that initial moment of complete novelty, we were in a situation that seems to me entirely analogous to the situation of the inquirers in the 17th century.
And there's another point I want to bring up, and that is that, again, it's not at all my field. I have never read about historical epidemiology, but I did read a book by a medical historian about epidemiologists. And what was the point that was interesting for me here is that he argues that that you look at a past epidemic. In this case, it was the Spanish fever, the
Spanish flu of 1918. Yes,
right, yes, sorry, Spanish flu, and to try to find out where did it begin and how did it develop, in order to, so you're looking back into the past in order not just to understand what's happening in the present, but also to perhaps come up with a prognosis or a speculation, or I'll call it speculation now, about how this one might develop and where it might go. And so it was this double or almost triple temporality that I then got interested in. Something happening in the present asks you to look back into the past in order to try to understand not even necessarily to stop something in the future, but to understand how something might look in the future, or what we then call in literature the future perfect.
Yeah, because I think that's very apt in many ways. I think that because we tend to think of the sciences as hurtling toward the future and the humanities as oriented toward the past, we don't realize the extent to which the sciences are enormously dependent upon their own archives and their own historical data. That's perhaps becoming more and more obvious with regard to climate change, but I agree entirely with regard to epidemiology.
And that's where suddenly the Spanish flu was the thing that everyone was talking about this year, a flu that most people had never really realized what it was, because it was a way of thinking, again, how did this happen? And that's where the narrative comes in. Where did it start? How did it spread? Why did it spread? Could that have been prevented? What did it mean that we didn't look at this? What does it mean that we then called it the forgotten flu for so many years, etc.? So this looking back, not just to understand the present, but to understand the future, that I found utterly intriguing.
It occurs to me I should have, in fact, done a little bit of introduction in jumping into the first question, because I think both of your most recent books are things that our audience would like to read and know more about. And Elisabeth, which is right now in German, but will probably appear in English, I would guess, is called something like Infected, Contemporary Thoughts on Pandemics and Culture. And besides the wonderful, which we've already shown off, a graffiti version of the Dance of Death, which is a beloved medieval Swiss painting subject, which was sprayed near the cathedral in Zurich earlier this year. I believe you discuss so many artworks with which we have become reacquainted. I think Boccaccio must have not had as many readers in the past half century as he had this year. And the same, I think, is true for the pandemic films you discussed, as well as for the works of literature like Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Rider, Pale Horse. So that's one direction from which we discuss. Lorraine's book, Against Nature, on the other hand, I think in a way was also a perfect intellectual preparation for this, because you discuss the way that science has thought about what belongs to nature, what laws of nature should be like, because they can't be like the laws which are constantly broken in human society, and how one could conceive exceptions or breaks in them, or other modes of disturbance in these laws, which of course are being formulated by us fallible humans who don't predict the future at all well. One thing that I thought, coming from both directions, seem to converge is the power of fantasy, the power of apparently unfounded speculation to predict or to come together with almost eerie accuracy with reality. And this is something that we see in some of Elisabeth's examples from horror and science fiction. On the other hand, the anxiety about what is natural. Are we, as an urban society, are we inside or outside the laws of nature? Clearly, the laws of epidemiology apply to us all too well. But how do we conceive ourselves and our diseases, which we also think of as spreading unnaturally because someone ate a forbidden animal? So I just wonder how the fantastic and the natural come together in this moment and in your thought.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the kinds of narratives which have developed around the origins of this virus, and how very quickly these narratives have become moralized. So one might argue that the World Health Organization delegation, which I think has just left China, is on a sober fact-finding mission. But in fact, in the court of worldwide public opinion, they are on trial. And the narrative, in many ways, has become a narrative, as Andrei formulated, of eating a forbidden animal, at least in some cultures, but it's also become a narrative of nature's revenge, in which human beings, because of their increasing encroachment on the habitats of other species, come into ever closer and more dangerous contact with repositories of other viruses that we might normally have not encountered. Instead of viewing this as simply a misfortune, it is seen to some extent as a matter for guilt and reproach. So it's not just an imagination, which is here at work, it's a highly moralized imagination, which is at work.
And that's exactly where I think the two discourses come together, because I was then interested, you know, when you said eat of a forbidden animal, you could also see eat of a forbidden fruit. And then we come right to one of the figures that I got so interested in, namely the gendering of all of this. Now, this isn't completely true for what we're actually seeing in the news, but it is true for one of the films that everyone was watching again, namely Contagion. And when you look at Contagion, it has to do with this promiscuous woman. She is sexually promiscuous. She is emotionally promiscuous. She's very curious. And she's also, when it comes to space, she's spatially promiscuous. I found this concept of spatial promiscuity in a book by Priscilla Ward on contagion narratives. And I say all this because I was then thinking, yeah, the feminine body has always been connected with contagion, has always been connected with disease, is always the one that you have to shield yourself from since Eve, but also since Pandora opens her box and releases all the illnesses. And that's when, because I reread The Apocalypse, since I thought we weren't in the apocalypse, and that's when I came up again when I saw again this in the Whore of Babylon, who also brings all these diseases. And in all cases, it's not just finding someone who's culpable or coming up with a story that says, okay, this is how it began for this and this reason. And in all cases, these are stories of transgression, whether it's transgressing against nature or because someone ate from a bad animal, or the newest thing I'm hearing is that someone was actually working in a Chinese lab and then they touched some. So these are always stories of transgression. And someone must be responsible, or a whole group of people must be responsible. But the other thing that is connected with this moralizing, which fascinated me so much, and it's exactly what you just said, that rather than reading it as something unfortunate, an accident, a contingency, you have to, there's an incredible need, we seem to have an incredible need, whether as writers of fiction or journalists or the public in general, to see this as a necessary narrative. Something happened and it needed to develop in this way, and it needed to develop in this way. That is to say, a kind of a set of events that are logically connected, because if we see it just as a misfortune, as an accident, as a contingent event that has no meaning, I think it's much harder to deal with than if we come up with these narratives. And moralizing is one of them. Conspiracy theory is another one of them. This is very big in Europe, and I think it's also big in the States. About now, let's just with pandemic, because again, it's this need for sense making and this need for feeling there must be some meaning behind this, and if we could only figure out what that meaning is, then etc etc etc. And that's where the targeting becomes interesting. The question of moralizing brings with it the targeting: who's guilty, who's not guilty, meaning I'm not responsible or I am innocent, the other one is.
I mean, it reminds me of a historian of medicine colleague of mine once summarized pre-modern views about illness as, if you're sick, it's somebody's fault. And I think what's really interesting about what Elisabeth has just said is that, in a sense, the narratives that scientists are telling are also narratives of causal connections. That is, this is a misfortune, but it's not a random event. We believe that there is a chain of causation which will eventually link the origins of this virus, perhaps in another species, it's unclear which species at the moment, to its eventual contact with human beings, its spread throughout the world. What's added to the narratives that Elisabeth has just sketched is blame. So not only a cause, A causes B, but A is responsible and therefore accountable and guilty of B. And I wonder whether we're going to look at a relatively short period, at least in Western intellectual history, between about the Lisbon earthquake in the middle of the 18th century, and perhaps really Hurricane Katrina at the beginning of the 21st century as an anomaly in which there really were such things as random events, random catastrophes, which were unlucky, tragic in their consequences, but which were nobody's fault. And I wonder whether or not we're in the midst of a kind of metaphysical shift in which it is somebody's fault. If the climate is changing, it's somebody's fault. If we have a pandemic, it's somebody's fault.
But I think there's another thing with this, it's somebody's fault. I was taken not just with the similarities in these previous texts about how people, if they'd only stayed at home, they wouldn't have spread the illness, and how the rich leave their homes and go to the country and, you know, leave the poor, you know, the whole social inequality in situations where actually everyone is touched by the contagion. But more importantly also, and that picks up on the question of fantasy, not wanting to see. And I kept thinking what the 9/11 Commission report had faulted the then US government, namely lack of imagination. Mm-hmm. And I felt lack of imagination is what we definitely, and I have to say, me too. In January, I was getting emails from students from Wuhan, and I was like, what are they writing to me about? This can't really be all the things students will come up with not to hand in their papers on time. Within weeks, I really had to slap myself because, but then why didn't we see this? We could have seen this. And one of the things that I then researched as I was looking at the pandemic films, and I was interested in the beginning of the pandemic film in the 50s in relationship to the Cold War and the war simulations, I came up with a story, or I noticed a story in the New York Times about the simulation called Crimson Contagion, which the Bush government had actually done, or had asked people to do. This involved, you know, the Mayo Clinic and National Security and the Pentagon and governors of states like Illinois and New York. And it was a real-time simulation, which started in, let's say, March and ended in October. And they played through pretty much what happened now. Someone comes from China, lands in Chicago, meets his son, he's contacted a virus. Other people have spread it to Japan, to France, to England. The son goes to a football game, super spreader. And what they were, of course, interested in was what wasn't going to work. So by October, they had, you know, millions of contacted people, so many dead people, etc. Then they passed this on to the government, and the government, I don't know what they did. They didn't look at it. This didn't come up in the news until March, when there was a hearing in regard to this simulation. Now, the fact that the Trump government didn't pay any attention to this is not unusual in so many of the texts that I read, so many of the films that I've looked at. People aren't paying attention. That is what's unusual about the film Contagion, that this is the one film where everyone is trying to be very, very, very sane. So now this is my point. What does this mean? That we could know things, but we choose not to know them. That we could, you know, it's not just a prophecy or a speculation, but we could read the signs immediately and behave in a certain way, and we choose not to. Yeah. And I think this brings in, sorry,
please go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think this brings in another dimension to the question of guilt, blame, and accountability. What do we want to, and what can we not see for whatever reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the administration, any administration, regardless of its political valence, would argue that they are constantly juggling any number of horrific scenarios. And the question is, which one do you do you actually focus on? But I think there's a much deeper point that you are making, which is whether or not there's something about our imagination now, which is because of the way we live now, is more cramped than perhaps in earlier periods. So one of the most disturbing aspects of the pandemic, I think, for most people, was that their lives suddenly became completely unpredictable. It became actually laughable to have a calendar of the sort most people used to have that extended 6 months, a year, 2 years into the future. It seemed absolutely ludicrous that one would have the hubris to plan in this way. That would not have been the case even, I think, 2 generations ago, because the horizon of planning, of certain planning, was much shorter, that radius. We have grown used to living in a world, at least those of us who are privileged to live in the cities from which we are, the three of us are speaking, in which, for the most part, one can reckon with averages. One can reckon with the stability of the world. And that confidence, which makes a certain kind of just-in-time global connectivity possible, is also a constriction of the imagination for future eventualities.
I completely, I think that's, if you ask me what could we take from this, it's things like living with contingency, learning to be open again to eventualities, as you just said, rather than having everything fixed in place. I mean, that's precisely what I'm seeing here at the moment. People send me doodles for the entire year. I'm like, are you insane? Ask me what I can do this week, next week, and the following week, and after that, let's reconfigure. To say that has something to do with looking at nature again differently. It does have a little bit with not. One of the people I started reading, who I had not read before, was Donna Haraway's new book on tentacular thinking, the book on the Cthulhu. And it suddenly made perfect sense to me to take the anthropos out and not just to see ourselves in the center of something that is perfectly timed and perfectly slotted and whatever, and to realize that, well, something has just happened and now I have to recalibrate everything. All these things that I thought I had to do, I had to go to this conference, I had to go to this, I can't do any of these things right now. What does that mean about, why is this upsetting to me? Why is this not freeing? I think it does mean for us to rethink our, of course, extremely privileged position, because we're not actually faced with, none of us are frontline workers, so we're not faced with the horror that people were experiencing, especially in March and already in February in Italy, actually. But a rethinking of how, as you say, constrained so much our life has become in the last year or 2 or 3.
There's a request for the Donna Haraway reference. Is this the book called Staying with the Trouble?
Yes.
I wanted to remark on something that maybe grows out of what Elisabeth just said, namely, of course, we as panelists are not frontline workers in any meaningful way, and we are trying to think and make contact with the pandemic, which of course can be as dangerous for us as for everyone in the audience, but through certain layers of mediation and probably of social safeties that a lot of people don't have. But one thing about even the idea of the contagion, which as people have noticed has been used as metaphor for everything from falling in love in Plato to sympathy with other human beings in David Hume in the 18th century. On the other hand, the idea that this virus is in itself a meaningless biological entity out of which we try to read so much about everything from our relation to nature to each other and to deities, in a way, it's a wonderful metaphor for what I do, which is, as an art historian, try to interpret pictures. But what all three of us do as humanists, trying to interpret the world often through human-made, but also through natural or constructions made by humans out of natural objects. So that, I mean, there's a question: if we were omniscient and we knew what the pandemic meant and who was to blame and what causes were responsible, is that a realistic ideal to aim for, or should we just try to not be particularly capricious, self-seeking interpreters who just see in it whatever we like to see? And this is connected maybe to something that certainly comes up in Elisabeth's book, especially towards the end, an idea of apocalypse and utopia, of strikingly, so many pandemic films and books paint a much darker picture, the end of humanity, the extinction of life on Earth, or in any case of human life. And we can see why that's maybe more compelling than the daily grind of a realistic infection. But of course, it also seems to carry with it the promise of a new start, of a fresh start, just like the old flood narratives that so many cultures have in their past. And just to mention a few of the contemporary utopian visions that have come up, a feminist utopia where when everyone goes back to work, women will be in the front rank of professional life. This is something that was brought up by an Italian medical expert who works at the University of Florida, and which sounds a lot like 1970s feminist science fiction, where often there would be a plague wiping out all the men. Again, the thought of the end of capitalism, or of its final stymieing in the general economic downturn that's taking place. And maybe most hopeful, the idea that nature will bloom again, or that we will approach it in a more thoughtful and gentle way when the chance to consume again at full tilt is open to us. I wonder if you think these utopian visions are, as it were, just flashes that will fade away once creature comforts have been restored, or whether pandemics really can carry with them also the seed of genuine change.
I must say the historian in me is pessimistic. I want to believe, I really want to believe, but I can tell you on the basis of 1348, the plague in Florence, or 1666, the plague in London, for about 6 months afterwards, people are full of good resolutions. They have been shaken into a consciousness of all that's wrong with themselves and with their society. This lasts about less than a year. So I think this is not to say it's not impossible that there might not be such a fresh start, but I think, to return to Elisabeth's point earlier, it's going to require an enormous, not just an enlargement of the imagination for the possible, but a much different imagination, not for the vision of the society we want to live in, but rather for what would be the step-by-step mechanisms which would lead us from here to there.
Yeah, I would say going into the pandemic archive of literature gives you a very similar picture, because whether it's Boccaccio, whether it's Defoe, whether it's Mary Shelley. I mean, Mary Shelley, I'll say something a little more about that moment, because that's the time narrative, but all of them, it's exactly that. Initially, people are amazed, they're horrified, and I felt that one could read the Camus novel, The Plague, really as the kind of 5 stages, like the way that Melanie Klein talks about the 5 stages of mourning. This is like the 5 stages of how to deal with a catastrophe like the pandemic. First, it's like, this is not true. Then, oh my God, it's really here. Then let's heroically go against it. And then monotony and exhaustion, but also the sense of what have we learned from this. And at the end, it's over and everyone forgets. And that is what you see again and again and again, the mixture between first an awareness, a self-consciousness, and then routine comes in again, or desire comes in again, political, financial interests come back into play. And that I think is I mean, it would be good if we would at least hold on to this thought and try to talk about this for the next few months, that the things we have learned, the things that have become visible for us, because that's kind of what I'm doing with the pandemic, not to say this person is guilty or this person's accountable, but more to say something has been rendered visible. Let's take this seriously. And of course, obviously, this is not the end of cruise ships, nor is it the end of mass tourism, but could we use this to talk more about being conscious about what we're doing in this globalized world, et cetera, but I do fear that humans are what they are. And I think that that's the fascination that these apocalyptic narratives have, is that that's like we're all punished. It's like, because they're not listening, they're not paying attention, so everyone needs to be punished. But the point, even with apocalyptic novels and apocalyptic films, is someone is narrating the story, someone is making the film. There's always a survivor, even if it's a mutant or it's a, I don't know, another creature. So it may be post-human, and that was one of the things that I got interested in at the very beginning. We were all remarking on how, you know, healthy the air suddenly smelled, and that we weren't seeing all kinds of, you know, stripes in the air or whatever. And then people were making all of these photographs about animals being in places where they weren't normally, until we discovered, well, that's actually not true. The swans were not really in Venice, etc. But the really important thing about those images was there were no people in them. So this was almost a kind of self-congratulatory, oh, look, if I only stayed at home, then everything would be so peaceful outside. But this is nonsense. And so it's kind of, I think we do also have to ask ourselves, why is it always between utopia and apocalypse? Why isn't it in a more reasonable way, trying in little ways to rejuggle positions? That would be my optimism.
Can I ask you a question? Because in reading your book, which I enjoyed mightily, it seemed to me that there was a kind of, despite the medium, the changes in media, the changes in settings, centuries, etc., there was a kind of dreadful repetitiveness about these narratives. And it was it almost, just as Andrei said, that it's Philemon and Bacchus, it's Noah's Ark, it's over, and Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, over and over again. Do you think that we could imagine as that writers of fiction, makers of, as it were, our fantasies, our collective fantasies, could imagine their ways out of this narrative?
Absolutely. But that was what I found so fascinating. It's not just that the authors are all picking up on each other, they're all quoting each other, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And in the films, there's always a slight turn. Who is the rogue? You know, is it the woman who brings in the dangerous thing from Cuba? Or is it, you know, the rogue military that brings in the virus from North Africa? But it is always the same narrative. And I think maybe there's a genre I didn't look into, which is real science fiction, that comes up with different narratives. But I was being strict. I really needed narratives that are pandemic narratives. And it is repetitive, because I think this is the only story we seem to be able to come up with, these 5 stages as I characterize them. And these are the stories that we've been telling all year long.
And as Andrei says, for millennia, we've been telling these stories. I wonder if I could just add just one drop of optimism to this otherwise wormwood bitter brew, which is there were very similar kinds of stories told, exactly the same plot line that you just described, about nuclear holocaust in the 1960s and 70s. And they were told both in the form of novels and in the form of television programs, and also notoriously in films that were so disturbing they could not be screened in the United Kingdom. But although these films themselves offered not a silver thread in a very dark cloud, they actually fueled the disarmament movement. That is, they actually led by sheer terror to political action of the more step-by-step kind that we despair of at the moment. They did change collective opinion, and they changed collective opinion in ways that were politically consequential. So I really add that one silver thread to this dark cloud, lest we abandon all hope.
I think maybe, I mean, this is a genre question now, but I'm just going to put it out there. I think maybe that's really the difference between the pandemic film genre, Wald calls it the contagion narrative, and the nature apocalypse films. I mean, these are all interconnected. You know, war games, especially in relationship to nuclear war, pandemic films, and nature catastrophe films. And I think nature catastrophe films work the way those anti-war films worked. And maybe we need to tap more into those to get people aware of how serious we should take climate change. There's something about the pandemic narrative, I think, because it's based always on a small group of people, a little family unit or a unit of friends or one person who is the witness, that brings this redundancy, because it's always about how can we overcome this catastrophe, because it's a catastrophe we can overcome. I think that's the point with the pandemics. They will eventually be over. They may have devastating consequences. They may have produced mutants in the human beings, but they will be over. And I think that's the tricky bit here, because I was also trying to argue, people like, why would anyone watch pandemic movies right now? Wouldn't you want to watch Ozu movies, you know, elegant Japanese people sitting for 3 hours talking to each other while drinking tea, or light comedies, or perhaps, you know, rediscover musicals? No. And I really think it's because there's something optimistic about these pandemic films, these surviving units. But I think that's also the problem with them. That's the, you know, from point of view of ideological criticism, one would say that's how you don't change anything.
I wonder whether there's something, actually, there's an insight in these repetitive plots, which is that without a certain kind of very human sociability, intimate sociability, these pandemics would have no chance. That is, they depend upon certain kinds of close human interactions in order to spread. And therefore, they really lend themselves to, as you say, an eruption within a small social unit, and then an exponential spread. But they also lend themselves to discussions of blame for just that reason.
Yeah. I am going to just sound an outside note and say that I really should be bringing in some of our audience's questions into the debate. But interestingly, and it may be because our panelists have been reading the chat, several of answers or discussions have come up. So for instance, Jim Morton was asking about parallels between pandemic narratives and our pandemic plight now, and 1950s fear of nuclear fallout and nuclear destruction, and the connection of that to Cold War vision of the communist enemy. And this is precisely what Lorraine has been talking about. And I'd want to add that one of the classic vampire pandemic nuclear novels, which was filmed many times, is Matheson's I Am Legend, which was first made into a movie that Elisabeth discusses in her book, The Last Man on Earth, and has been made into a film many times, including one starring Will Smith. And however, in the filmings, they often leave out the pointe, the really surprising ending, where it turns out that the lone surviving human is perceived as a monster by a new evolved or mutated population, which was, I think, as powerful in the 1950s, fear of the Red Menace, as it could be from a Donna Haraway, less anthropocentric perspective today. But I just wanted to acknowledge some audience questions that have come up, and so I won't rehearse them, but I do want to get some in there that that we perhaps haven't answered already. And one of them, David Morker asks, if it is indeed desirable to pursue causality, find out causes without attributing blame, and how we might do that, because to me that seems very difficult indeed. Etiology without blame, detectives without policemen.
Yeah, but I think that that's in fact the only productive course that epidemiologists and virologists can now take if they want to actually learn from this pandemic. So just think about it from a practical point of view, and this is being played out before our eyes in the last week. The moment at which this becomes a narrative of blame and guilt, it's very likely that crucial evidence will be destroyed or covered up. So if we're really interested in, as one tried to learn from the pandemic of the Spanish flu in 1918, to draw lessons from it, it's going to have to be rather like what airline pilots do. So there is a kind of the Federal Aviation Administration has a policy in which airline pilots are allowed to report in a completely no-fault fashion when things go wrong that almost lead to a terrible accident. And out of this accumulated body of information of near misses, an enormous amount has been learned about aviation safety, which is why, although none of us have done this anytime recently, it's much safer to get into a plane under normal circumstances than it is into your car. So I think the etiology is absolutely essential if we are going to learn anything out of this.
And I would add on to that, this, by the way, was the point of the simulation that they did last year. And this was the fourth simulation, because the simulation started under Obama in relationship to Ebola. And I think it means we have to think of storytelling differently, rather than saying there is one really linear development of causality. There could be many different causalities. This leads to this, but also to this, to this. This is interconnected, this is not interconnected, but, or all of these things are interconnected, but there is no single consequence, but several consequences that come out of that, to try to tell the story from multiple positions, but not people multiple positions, which is what the films do, but rather things that happen, and then this happens, and then they come together again, and here they don't. Deep, and in that sense, depersonalizing it, and that would be looking for the patterns, choices made that were good or bad, without saying, without value, without judging them, without bringing in an additional level of meaning, which is either moral or psychological or political. That would be a possibility. That would, no, that's a very optimistic position here.
Well, it strikes me that this has to do with our difficulty in conceiving and communicating and representing joint responsibility, let's not call it blame, but which is what has afflicted environmental activism for close to a century now, and which we face all the time in political decisions. You know, who is responsible for the rise of Hitler or of other violent movements? But how do we discover that without simply pointing fingers at someone who acted, when many who didn't act could have stopped it, right? So there, I was just thinking of that when Elisabeth was mentioning how we pat ourselves on the back that there are coyotes on the street, as if we'd done something by staying home. We're so proud of. Our inactivity is so powerful. And perhaps in some ways we have to choose not to act, not to consume a certain amount of fossil fuels, but that itself is not quite the same as simply sitting back and letting the world fix itself. I want to ask a question that came up in the audience, and it was prefaced as a slightly more personal question, but I think apposite to this question, which is, and especially for the two of you, what helps you most in dealing with and accepting the current travel limitations, asks one of our audience members, Simone Berci.
Yes, well, I'm tempted to say Zoom, but that is perhaps had an answer. this is a very personal answer. Of course, especially since a lot of family and friends are on other continents, I'm sure that holds for many people in the audience as well. It is bitter not to be able to travel and see them. But on the other hand, every time I think about how my blood pressure soared, my pulse raced as I went through an airport trying to catch the next flight, I am relieved that my little suitcase is parked in the basement gathering dust. So counterfactual at the moment of what it would really be like to set my alarm clock for 4 a.m. again to get to the airport on time in order to get to my destination to hold the next talk, often has the effect of a bucket of cold water splashed in my face when I'm inclined to romanticize the days when we traveled all the time.
Yeah, but again, I think we're privileged. I see it the same way. I am so happy that I have not had to take that lovely tram, which takes me to the airport, and run through that airport all year long. But I would also, I actually have to say, although Zoom is sometimes an irritating tool, curiously enough, because I can't travel, I am connecting more with people, and I'm connecting with people who I haven't been connecting with. People, friends in Italy, friends in America, friends in England, who we, normally I depended on, we're going to be at that conference together, or I'm going to be giving a talk, or on the way home I'll drop off and see them, which meant I didn't. And now, because we're not moving anywhere, we have time, and I also felt the need to connect with people. This was something that I noticed very soon after the lockdown in Switzerland, that I started calling up people, also older friends of mine, just to find out how, what's happening. And we have continually been calling each other in a way that we hadn't before, and Zooming just to see what's going on. So in some strange way, although I would love to meet people physically again soon, it's opened up connections as well that I wouldn't have had if I were constantly traveling to this or to that destination for work. So I think it's important that we panelists here emphasize that when we travel, we tend to do this for work, and that we're doing it in often very short time segments. So sometimes really, I keep telling you, this is a logistics problem. I just don't know how to get to Berlin within 8 hours from where I am before that. I think maybe other people are thinking about traveling like, I just like to get out of my city. I would just like to see a park somewhere else, etc. Yeah, patience.
And one of the
And books.
yeah
Books.
And yeah, books. You can travel in books. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Andrei, you were going to say something.
Well, one of the things you mentioned is traveling closer to home and seeing places that you have neglected because they weren't an 8-hour flight away, which I think many of us have done willingly or unwillingly, with interesting results. Besides finally reading long novels like Der Zauberberg, The Magic Mountain, or other works opposite to the situation at hand.
Oh, we have to stop.
Yes, we're getting to the end of our hour, and you have no idea how much I regret it. I could go and listen to you the entire rest of the afternoon, and I would just have like the most wonderful day in a cold and snowy environment. I would thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for our audience to join us in the middle of the day. If you have friends who missed the conversation because it is in the middle of the day, it will be, we have recorded it. We will post a video on our YouTube channel at the Goethe-Institut, and I believe that it will be on the YouTube channel of the Swiss Embassy as well. And yeah, thank you so much on behalf of the Goethe-Institut, especially to our friends at the Swiss Consulate in Chicago. We love working with you. Thank you, everybody. It was a very marvelous event. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for
Yes.
organizing this and for
Yes,
together with us.
Andrei, for
And thank you, Andrei, very well.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andrei.
It was pure fun for me.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.